Lingqi. In ancient China, one of the most terrifying punishments ever devised was lingqi, often translated as death by 1,000 cuts. Unlike a quick execution, lingqi was designed to prolong the pain and humiliation. The condemned would be tied up in public, and the executioner would slowly cut away flesh, starting with less vital areas before moving on to the organs that would ensure death. This gruesome process could last for minutes or even hours, depending on the skill of the executioner and the will of the authorities. Lingqi was not simply a killing, but a spectacle meant to strike terror into the hearts of those who witnessed it. To witness it was to serve as a reminder of the absolute power of the state and the horrific consequences of betrayal, treason, or other serious crimes. For many, the physical pain was only part of the punishment. The real horror lies in the psychological torment of being torn apart piece by piece, knowing death was inevitable but cruelly delayed. Lin Tree is one of history's darkest reminders of how cruelty was once institutionalized as justice. Impaling. Impalement was one of the most brutal and horrific forms of punishment in history, widely used in parts of Europe and the Middle East. The method was as simple as it was brutal. A sharp wooden or metal stake was driven through the victim's body, usually starting in the rectum or vagina, and pushing up until it emerged from the mouth, chest, or shoulders. The condemned person was then placed upright, their own weight ensuring the stake remained firmly embedded while the life was slowly drained away. What made impalement so horrifying was its prolonged nature. The victim could survive for hours, even days, writhing in agony as onlookers watched. Beyond the unbearable physical pain, impalement was seen as a public display of power. A warning carved into flesh for all to see. Leaders like Vlad the Piledriver of Wallachia used it not only as a form of punishment, but also as a form of psychological warfare, lining up victims in the streets to instill terror. In many ways, staking was more than just an execution. It was a deliberate display of cruelty, designed to remind people that disobedience could result in one of the most horrific deaths imaginable. Breaking wheel. The breaking wheel, also known as the Catherine wheel, was one of the most gruesome punishments in medieval Europe. The condemned was tied to a large wooden wheel, arms and legs spread out, completely exposed. Then, using iron bars or hammers, the executioner would systematically break the victim's limbs, twisting them around the spokes of the wheel into grotesque shapes. Once broken, the body was often hung high for birds and the elements to eat away at, turning death into both torture and farce. Sometimes death came quickly with a reprieve to the chest or head, but more often it was slow and painful, leaving the victim to suffer for hours, even days. The breaking wheel was not only painful, but also public humiliation and a brutal display of power. Crowds gathered to watch, horrified but also compelled, as justice was meted out in its darkest form. For centuries, this punishment has symbolized absolute control, where law and cruelty blend, and the human body itself becomes a canvas for fear. Boiling alive. Boiling alive was one of the most gruesome punishments of medieval Europe, a method that combined spectacle and excruciating pain. Unlike a quick execution, this punishment prolonged death over a long ordeal. Victims were lowered into large cauldrons filled with water, oil, pitch, or even molten metal, heated until they boiled. Sometimes, to prolong the agony, they were placed in a scalding liquid that gradually increased in temperature, ensuring that every nerve felt the searing heat. The screams of the condemned echoed through the crowds gathered to witness the horrific spectacle, reminding all of the price that could be paid for crime and disobedience. Boiling alive was usually reserved for acts considered particularly heinous: poisoning, treason, or insults to the church and rulers. Beyond the unimaginable physical torment, this punishment was also intended to dehumanize, turning execution into a public warning that would be seared into memory. For medieval society, it represented not only justice, but also terror as a tool of control. Today, the thought of being boiled alive is a chilling reminder of how far humanity has gone in blending law, cruelty, and fear into a horrific ritual. Execution by elephant. Execution by elephant is a classic example of how punishment can be both dramatic and terrifying in South and Southeast Asia. In this method, trained elephants are used as instruments of death, capable of crushing bodies in seconds or over extended periods of time, depending on the ruler's command. Sometimes the animals are ordered to slowly break bones before delivering the fatal blow, a prolonged display of absolute control. Unlike many other punishments carried out in secret, these executions are staged in front of large crowds, turning death into a display of power. The choice of elephants is no coincidence. These giants symbolize royal power and unstoppable strength, a reminder that disobedience is met with overwhelming force. Aside from the physical destruction, the psychological horror of facing such a death was immense, as the victim was exposed not only to pain, but also to the terrifying presence of the beast itself. Over the centuries, this punishment has cemented the image of rulers as masters of both man and nature, using fear to ensure obedience. It remains one of history's most memorable blends of cruelty, symbolism, and power. Crucifixion. Crucifixion was one of the most notorious forms of execution in antiquity, perfected by the Romans as a form of punishment that served as both a deterrent and a warning. The condemned were stripped, beaten, and forced to carry the heavy wooden beam of a cross to the place of execution. There, they were bound or nailed to the wrists and feet, suspended above the ground in excruciating pain. Death was rarely quick. Victims suffered from blood loss, dehydration, exhaustion, and slow asphyxiation as their bodies struggled to breathe. Sometimes the ordeal lasted for days, with soldiers and crowds watching the life slowly drain away. Crucifixion was more than just a way to kill. It was designed to humiliate, strip away dignity, and make an example of the condemned to all who passed by. The sight of crucified bodies lying on the streets of Rome was meant to strike fear into the hearts of the populace, a brutal reminder of the power of the empire. More than just an execution, crucifixion was a psychological warfare, ensuring loyalty and obedience through one of the most horrific displays of suffering in history. Pouring molten metal. Molten metal was one of the most gruesome forms of punishment practiced in parts of ancient Persia and Rome, a method that combined spectacle with unimaginable pain. Instead of swords or ropes, executioners used molten gold, silver, or lead, heated until it became liquid fire. The molten substance was then poured directly into the victim's mouth, ears, or even down his throat, burning him from the inside. Death was often instantaneous, but the image it created was of scorched flesh, and screams were instantly silenced. The punishment, often reserved for those accused of treason, blasphemy, or crimes against a ruler, emphasized not only the destruction of the body, but also the loss of speech. Some accounts suggest that molten gold was chosen to mock greed, turning wealth into an instrument of torture. Unlike slow executions, this method combined speed with sheer brutality, ensuring that those who witnessed it carried the memory of what they had seen with them for the rest of their lives. Molten metal pouring remains one of the most gruesome examples of how ancient civilizations turned justice into theater, using cruelty to instill fear and absolute obedience. Brazen bull. The bronze bull of ancient Greece was a horrifying invention, a mixture of cruelty and horror. Crafted entirely of bronze, the statue was hollow and shaped like a real bull. The victim was trapped inside the beast's belly, and a fire was lit underneath until the metal turned a fiery red. As the body was roasted, each scream echoed through a series of tubes, transforming the human cry into the demonic roar of a bull. This bizarre illusion turned the execution into a play. Terrifying and amusing to onlookers, the punishment was designed not only to kill, but to strip away dignity, turning suffering into a spectacle of art and fear. According to legend, even its inventor, Peiros of Athens, was forced to experience his own creation when a tyrant tested the device. The Bronze Bull remains one of history's most horrifying symbols of the human imagination warped toward cruelty. It reminds us that punishment in the ancient world was not just about ending life, but also about terror, control, and leaving a memory so terrible that it could never be forgotten. Quartering. Quartering was one of the most gruesome forms of execution used in medieval and early modern Europe, designed to inflict not just death, but horror. The condemned was tied by the wrists and ankles to four strong horses, each facing a different direction. At the signal, the animals were driven forward, tearing the body apart limb by limb. Sometimes, to prolong the spectacle, executioners weakened the victim first by cutting into joints or tendons, ensuring the separation was slow and agonizing. Crowds gathered to watch as the human body was transformed into a brutal lesson of power, a clear message of what awaited traitors or those who defied authority. Beyond the unimaginable pain, the psychological impact was immense. Families of the accused were often forced to witness the dismemberment, while pieces of the body might be displayed publicly as warnings. Quartering was not only a punishment, but also a statement, an attempt to etch obedience into memory through sheer terror. It remains one of history's starkest reminders of how far societies once went in merging cruelty with control,